In the summer of 1947, a group of German women held in a British prisoner of war camp did something that no one, not their guards, not their commanders, not the government officials processing their files, had anticipated. They wrote letters asking to stay. Not to be freed, not to be pardoned, not for any of the things prisoners are supposed to want. They wrote formal, careful, clear-eyed letters to the British Army requesting permission to remain in the country that had captured them, in the camp that held them, doing the work they had been assigned as prisoners of a war they had lost. Some of them had been saying the same thing out loud for months, to anyone who would listen. One of them put it in writing so plainly it stopped a senior officer mid-read. "Please do not send us back to nothing." This is the story of what turned enemy women into people who begged their captors to keep them. It is not the story you think it is, and the part that will stay with you longest is not the war. It is what grew after it. The repatriation notice was 3 lines long. That was the first thing Martha Schreiber noticed, not the date, not the typed name near the top, not even the official seal pressed into the lower corner like a wound that had long since stopped bleeding. She noticed the length, 3 lines, 3 lines to tell a woman that the country she had spent 16 months learning to trust was now finished with her. 3 lines to close a door she had not expected to find open in the first place. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along the existing crease. The paper was thin, already worn at the edges from being handled by too many indifferent fingers before reaching her, and placed it face down on the narrow wooden shelf beside her bunk, as though it might change its mind if given enough time to consider what it had just said. It was July 1947. Outside the window of Barracks D at Camp Featherstone in the West Riding of Yorkshire, the English summer was doing what English summers did without apology. It was raining softly, without force, without drama, the way this country seemed to do almost everything. The fields beyond the wire fence were the greenest thing Martha had seen in years. The same fields she had spent the last 6 months walking to and from each morning under the quiet supervision of Sergeant Hammond. The same fields where she had learned that soil could be coaxed rather than commanded, that patience was itself a kind of instruction. She sat on the edge of her bunk and looked at the shelf, at the folded paper, at the ceiling, at her own hands. Across the room, Ingrid Hartmann was watching her. Ingrid had arrived at Featherstone the same week as Martha, in the cold grey March of 1946, transferred from a processing camp farther south after the initial chaos of surrender had sorted itself into something resembling administration. Ingrid was 24 years old, had been a signals clerk for an artillery division in the final months of the war, and carried her bitterness the way other women carried photographs, clothes, carefully, as though she was afraid it might get wet. She was the person in the barracks most likely to notice something without saying it aloud, and the most likely to say it aloud anyway when silence ran out of room. "You got one too," Ingrid said, not a question. Martha did not answer immediately. Through the window, the rain had softened into mist. A blackbird was working something loose from the edge of the vegetable patch near the south fence, the small garden that Martha and 3 other women had begun in February when the ground thawed enough to accept a spade. "September," Martha said finally. Ingrid let out a breath. "Mine says August," she paused. "So home." The words sat in the room like something dropped from a height. Neither of them moved for a long moment. "Is there one?" Martha asked, not bitterly, honestly. Ingrid had no answer for that, which was an answer in itself. Stay with this story. What happens next is the part nobody talks about in the history books, and it will change how you see everything that came before it. To understand why 23 women in a prisoner of war camp in Yorkshire spent the summer of 1947 begging the British government to let them stay, you have to understand what they had expected when they arrived. Because what they expected and what they found were 2 different countries entirely, and the distance between those 2 things is where this story lives. First, the numbers, because the numbers matter. By the end of World War II, Britain held over 400,000 German prisoners on its soil, the largest POW population of any Allied nation on British territory. The majority were men, soldiers, officers, crew, but among them were several thousand women, auxiliaries, nurses, signal staff, clerical workers, the administrative infrastructure of a war machine that had employed women in uniform since 1940. These women occupied an administrative grey area that the British government handled with the same practical improvisation it applied to most things in the immediate aftermath of the war. Camps were designated, classifications were assigned, work programs were organized, and the question of what exactly to do with female prisoners of a defeated nation was answered, as most wartime questions were, by the needs of the moment rather than any prior theory. By 1946, the British government was facing a labour shortage serious enough to reshape policy. 6 years of war had drained the agricultural workforce. The fields needed bodies. The prisoner work program, already running for male POWs, was extended cautiously to selected female detainees with relevant skills or demonstrated capacity to learn. It was, as most practical solutions are, simultaneously reasonable and imperfect. But it put German women into English fields, onto English farms, into English communities, and it kept them there long enough for something the program designers had not anticipated to take root alongside the winter wheat. Martha Schreiber was 25 years old when she was captured. She had been a clerical worker in a Luftwaffe administrative office outside Hamburg. Not a soldier, not a combatant, but a woman behind a desk in a uniform, which by the spring of 1945 was close enough to the same thing to matter very little once the British Army began sweeping through. She spoke careful, textbook English learned in a gymnasium classroom before the war, the kind of English that could read a bill of lading and understand a radio broadcast, and do almost nothing to prepare you for a sergeant from Sheffield asking whether you took milk in your tea. She had been processed at a collection point in northern Germany before the transport. She had stood in lines with other women, auxiliary personnel and clerks and nurses, most of them young, most of them afraid, most of them certain, with the particular certainty that comes from years of wartime propaganda about the enemy, that what waited at the other end of the sea crossing was punishment. Not necessarily violence, perhaps not even cruelty, but something cold. Something designed to remind them, every day, in every small way, that they had been on the wrong side of something enormous, and that they would spend whatever time they had left accounting for it. The crossing itself was exhausting and miserable. The transport ship was not built for comfort. The women were kept in a lower deck, not harshly, but firmly, with guards who said little and looked past them when they looked up. Martha spent most of the crossing sitting against a steel wall, listening to the sound of the sea moving against the hull and thinking about her sister in Munich and wondering whether the apartment still stood. Some of the women slept. Others sat awake, in the particular way of people who have passed the point where sleep serves any useful function, who are simply waiting for the next event to arrive and tell them what to do. The air below deck smelled of salt and engine oil and the accumulated fatigue of people who had been uncertain for too long. One woman, a former signals clerk named Bridget, who had been captured the same week as Martha, spent the crossing writing in a small notebook that she kept pressed against her knee as though someone might try to take it. Martha watched her without asking questions. There is a privacy to the things people hold on to in the middle of crossings, and it deserves to be respected. They arrived at a processing camp in the south of England on a Tuesday morning in March. The sky was white and cold, the light flat and diffuse in the way of English coastal mornings that have not yet decided whether to brighten or grey. The roads beyond the wire were impossibly narrow. The trees were still bare, the hedgerows dense and dark. The grass everywhere a particular shade of wet green that Martha had never seen before and that seemed, somehow, both foreign and familiar at once. Everything was smaller than expected, the buildings, the distances, the voices of the guards issuing instructions at the gate. Martha had imagined England as a place of scale, of imperial grandeur, the kind of country that occupied half the map in school atlases, solid and certain in red. What she found, at first glimpse, was something quieter and more worn than any map suggested. A country that had been holding its breath for 6 years and was only just beginning to exhale. A country that felt, in a way that unsettled her more than she could explain, like it had already been tired before the war started. The processing camp was orderly. That was the first surprise. There was a system, intake forms, medical checks, work classification, housing assignment, and the system functioned without apparent urgency. No one shouted. No one moved dramatically. A woman with a clipboard asked Marta's name, occupation, and whether she had any injuries or medical conditions, and wrote the answers down with the focused patience of someone who had asked the same questions 100 times and expected to ask them 100 times more. The questions were the same as the ones she had been asked at the German collection point, but the quality of the attention was different. The woman with the clipboard looked up when Marta answered. She wrote the answers in full. She checked, once, whether she had spelled the name correctly. There was tea, real tea, in a tin mug, handed to her without ceremony while she waited for her paperwork to be completed. The person who handed it to her, a young orderly who could not have been older than 18, said, in careful German that had clearly been learned from a phrase book and practiced with effort, "It's hot, be careful." Marta took the mug in both hands. She looked at him. He had a sparse blonde moustache and the slightly formal posture of someone who is performing a rehearsed act of goodwill and is not entirely sure it will land. He looked away after a moment, back to his own work. She held the mug for a long time before drinking from it. She was waiting for the trick, for the moment when the warmth was withdrawn, when the civility curdled into something else, for the thing her imagination, seasoned by years of wartime propaganda and months of accumulated dread, kept telling her was coming. There was no trick. 3 weeks later, she was transferred to Camp Featherstone in Yorkshire, one of several camps in the region that had begun assigning female detainees to agricultural labor support as part of the government's ongoing effort to address the farm labor shortage left by the war. The journey north by train was her first extended view of the English countryside, and she watched it through the window with the concentrated attention of a person cataloguing evidence. She had not expected the scale of the green. She had not expected the silence of it, the vast uninterrupted stretches of field and hedgerow and grey stone wall running across hillsides as though measuring out the land in careful increments. She had not expected how much of England simply appeared to be waiting, patient and permanent, for something human to finish its business and leave it alone. The camp itself had been built for male POWs earlier in the conflict, and the conversion to a mixed facility had happened quickly enough that some of the amenities were still being adjusted when Marta arrived. The barracks were plain. The beds were narrow. The bathrooms were shared, and the water was cold in the mornings, and the windows leaked when the wind came from the north, which was often. The common room had 3 tables and a shelf of books, and a cast-iron stove that heated it to a reasonable temperature on weekdays, but was banked on weekends with a frugality that suggested the fuel budget had been decided by someone who had never spent a Saturday night in Yorkshire. But there was enough food, 3 meals a day, plain and unremarkable but sufficient. There was enough warmth for sleeping. There were books in the common room, English ones, mostly, though someone had donated a German-language Bible and 2 copies of a pre-war Hamburg illustrated magazine that had been passed through so many hands the covers were nearly gone. These circulated through the barracks with the reverence of religious texts, not for their content, which was outdated and trivial, but for the fact of their existence, the evidence of a world that had once been ordinary, that had published illustrated magazines about gardening and music and summer holidays, that had existed before everything became urgent and terrible. There were no dogs straining at chains. There were no lights in the face in the middle of the night, no interrogation rooms, no one who required them to account for themselves beyond the daily roll call, which was conducted with the efficient brevity of something that existed on a list of things that needed to be done and was therefore done. The guards were armed, and the fences were real, and no one was unclear about what this place was and what it was not. But the language used to run it, the daily texture of life inside it, the specific small register of how orders were given and how time was organized and how problems were handled, was so far from what Marta had steeled herself to endure that she spent her first 2 weeks in a state of low, constant disorientation. She had been told to expect the worst. The worst had not shown up, and somehow, and this is the thing that history tends to miss, the absence of the worst was not simply a relief, It was its own kind of confusion, because a woman who has spent months preparing herself for cruelty does not know what to do with its opposite. Kindness, when you have been taught to fear it, can feel like a door left open by someone who has not yet decided what to do with you. You stand at the threshold for a long time, examining the frame, looking for the catch you are certain must be there. Sergeant Hammond was the person she interacted with most in those first weeks. He was the NCO responsible for Barracks D, a methodical man who communicated in the precise minimum of words required by any situation and extended this economy to everything: the roll calls, the work assignments, the administrative questions, the occasional awkward request for something the rules were not entirely clear about. He was not warm, he was not cold. He was consistent, which was, after everything, the thing Marta found most unexpectedly steadying. She had lived, for 3 years, in a world where consistency was the first casualty of any situation that required it. A man who simply did what he said he would do, at the time he said he would do it, in the manner he had previously indicated, this was not a small thing. She learned to trust the consistency before she learned to trust the man. This seemed, on reflection, like the correct order. The other women in Barracks D arrived at their own accommodations by different routes and at different speeds. Some remained guarded and interior for months, moving through the daily schedule with the mechanical compliance of people who have learned that compliance is the safest shape. Others adapted quickly, with a resilience that looked like toughness from the outside, but was, Marta suspected, simply a different strategy for surviving the same uncertainty. Elise, who was 19 and from Bavaria, and had never been more than 50 kilometers from her home village before the war, cried on her first 4 nights, and then stopped and never mentioned it. Hilda, the medical records clerk, organized her personal possessions on the first day with the systematic efficiency of someone who has decided that order, imposed on whatever space is available, is not a luxury but a necessity. They were, all of them, managing. This was what people did. The word for it, in the specific vocabulary of people who are trying not to say more than they mean, is coping. But coping is just management at a smaller scale, the daily decisions about where to put your weight so that the floor holds. If you found this channel today, you weren't meant to leave yet. Every story here is one the textbooks left out. Hit subscribe, because the next one is already waiting for you, and it's heavier than this one. The work program began in April. Each morning, Monday through Saturday, a small detail of women was marched the quarter-mile to a gate in the east fence, where a British Army truck would take them another 2 miles to the farm holdings operated by several local families who had applied for prison labor as part of the wartime agricultural scheme, a scheme that technically continued well into the post-war period. Because the labor shortage did not observe ceasefire dates, and the potatoes did not care who had won. The Pierce farm was the holding Marta came to know best. It sat on a long slope above a shallow river valley, surrounded by hedgerows thick enough to hold a secret and fields that stretched in every direction without apology. Mrs. Dorothy Pierce ran it largely alone. Her husband had come back from North Africa in 1944 with a damaged lung and an inability to stand for long periods, which meant he sat in the kitchen and managed accounts, while Dorothy walked the fields in Wellington boots with the expression of someone who had been quietly doing what needed doing for so long that urgency itself had become a form of calm. Dorothy Pierce was 53 years old, broad across the shoulders, economical with her words, and entirely devoid of the nervousness that some of the local farmers displayed around the German work details. She did not linger on what the women had been. She was interested in what they could do, and this Marta noticed within the first hour of the first morning what they might be capable of learning. First day was difficult, not because anyone was unkind, because Marta had never farmed. She had grown up in Hamburg, in a flat above a dry goods shop, with a balcony barely wide enough for 2 chairs and a single window box of geraniums her mother kept alive through stubbornness rather than expertise. The difference between a window box and a working field was the difference between a photograph and the country in the photograph, and the earth here did not give up easily. It resisted the spade. It held on to moisture and kept its layers private. There were stones you didn't expect and furrows that pulled at your boots and a whole language of soil that nobody had taught her and that Dorothy Pierce communicated, when asked, through brief demonstrations and no wasted words. The old farmhand, Tom Calvert, was the one who actually talked her through it. Tom was 61 and had been working the Pierce land since before Dorothy was born. He was a small man, slightly bowed at the shoulder from decades of stooped work, with hands that appeared to have been made separately from the rest of him, enormous, articulated, deeply lined, permanently tanned to the color of the soil they worked in. He moved slowly, with the deliberate economy of someone who understood that haste and farming made poor partners, and he spoke in a Yorkshire accent so thick that Marta's textbook English was nearly useless in decoding it for the first week. What saved her was the fact that Tom, despite the accent, communicated mostly with his hands. He showed her how to read soil by pressing it between fingers. He showed her how far apart to set seedlings so the roots had room to become themselves. He showed her how to tell, by the color of a leaf, whether something needed more water or more light or simply more time. He also showed her, without naming it as a lesson, how to be wrong without catastrophe. Farming is not the art of doing everything correctly. It is the art of understanding which mistakes can be recovered from and acting accordingly. A seedling planted too shallow can be reset. A row spaced too narrow can be thinned. Even a crop missed by harvest can be turned into the soil and made useful as winter cover. There is almost always a next season. This was not the kind of thinking Marta had been trained in. The last years of the war had been characterized by the logic of final things, of situations with no recovery path, of decisions made in the knowledge that the margin had been gone for a long time. Tom's unhurried pedagogy of soil and seed and patience was, in its way, a counter-argument to everything she had spent the past 3 years learning. She did not identify it as such for some time. She simply found that the hours on the Pierce farm were the hours in which something inside her was least tightly coiled. He never spoke about the war, not once, across the whole of the 2 years she worked that land. Marta understood this as a form of courtesy so profound it required no acknowledgement and repaid it in the same currency. It was Tom who, in the second week of April, pointed to the patch of ground behind the camp's south fence, barely 20 feet wide, hemmed in by a drainage ditch on one side and the fence post on the other, and said something she had to have repeated 3 times before she understood. That bit wants someone to mind it. She asked Sergeant Hammond that evening whether it would be permitted. Hammond was a man of 38 with a careful face and the manner of someone who had learned to weigh requests before answering them, not from suspicion, but from the understanding that small permissions, granted or refused, had weight. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said she could use it on her own time, within the south fence perimeter, if she kept it clear of the drainage channel and didn't disrupt the Saturday inspection path. That was the beginning of the garden. Pause for a second. I want to know, at what point in this story did something shift for you? Drop the timestamp in the comments. You'll be surprised how many people stopped at the exact same moment. The garden was not large. In its first season, it was barely more than a cleared patch of difficult ground, full of stones she had to remove by hand and soil that was denser than anything Tom had shown her on the farm. She had no money for seeds. What she had instead was a small collection of scraps, leftover potato cuttings from the kitchen bins, a handful of bean seeds given to her by one of the other women in the work detail, a single clutch of onion sets she found in the corner of a seed sack Mrs. Pierce had discarded. And she had time, which was the one thing a prisoner always had in abundance. She worked the garden in the evenings, after the day's assignment was done. Ingrid watched her from the barracks window and said nothing for 2 weeks, which was Ingrid's version of support. The other women in the hut were curious, then mildly interested, then quietly competitive. By May, 3 of them had claimed their own corners of the plot. By June, they had divided it into sections with thin strips of wood pressed into the earth as borders, the way you divide a thing you have all staked a claim to but are too careful to fight about. The beans came up first, then the onions in their slow, patient way, then something surprising, a volunteer tomato plant, self-seeded from some previous season, that appeared near the fence post in late May with an assertiveness that Marta chose to take as a sign of something, though she was not a woman who believed in signs. She wrote to her sister in Munich in June. The letter took 3 weeks to arrive and another 2 for the reply to come back. Her sister's handwriting was smaller than she remembered, as though the war had compressed something in her, and the news in the letter was the kind that arrives quietly and sits down heavily. The apartment was gone. Their parents' building was partially standing, the outer walls, some of the upper floor, but the interior had been destroyed in the bombings of 1943 and cleared in 1945. Their mother was alive, staying with cousins in the countryside. Their father had not been found. Marta read the letter once, then folded it and kept it. She did not read it again for a long time. That evening she went to the garden in the long English summer light and knelt in the soil beside the tomato plant and worked loose a stone she had been meaning to remove for a week. The stone came free with a satisfying resistance, and she held it in her palm for a moment, grey, irregular, cool, even in the warmth of the evening, before placing it on the small border she had built at the garden's edge. What she felt was not grief exactly. It was something older and less specific. The sense of having arrived in a world that had quietly arranged itself without her, that had made its decisions while she was occupied elsewhere, and that did not particularly require her understanding to continue functioning. She pressed her hands into the earth. The soil accepted the pressure without question. It didn't care where she was from, or what she had worn, or what had come down around her. She thought about her father for a moment, not directly, not with the full weight of it, just the periphery, the shape of an absence. Then she put the thought back where it lived, behind the part of her that was still working, and stood up and brushed her hands on the sides of her trousers. She stayed until the light faded. She went back every evening that summer. This was not something she decided. It was something she noticed herself doing, the way you notice a habit only after it has already formed. The garden was, in that first season, small and not particularly successful. The beans were productive, but the onions were disappointing, and the potatoes she had attempted from the kitchen scraps produced nothing useful. But that was not quite the point. The point was the specific quality of those evening hours, the long Yorkshire light lying warm across the plot, the smell of turned earth and something green, the sounds of the camp at its most quiet and the fields at their most present. There was a quality of attention available in the garden that was not available anywhere else. A focused, immediate attention that had no room for Germany, for the war, for her father's absence or her mother's uncertain handwriting. The work demanded your hands and your eyes and gave you back, in exchange, the clean specific fact of the present moment. She did not know yet what to call this. She would not have called it healing, because that word implies a wound with clean edges, and what she was carrying did not have clean edges, but it was something. She went back every evening. Don't skip ahead. The moment everyone remembers from this story, the one that stays with you for days, hasn't happened yet. It's coming. Stay. The first Christmas in England was strange in the particular way that things are strange when they refuse to be as bad as you have decided they will be. The camp commander, a quiet major named Holt, who ran Featherstone with the organizational precision of someone who believed that problems, like paperwork, were best handled before they became urgent, had arranged for a small formal acknowledgement of the holiday. There was no celebration. This was a prison camp, and the distinction mattered, but there was extra food on the 25th, a ration of something hot and sweet in the evening, and a brief period in the afternoon when the usual work assignments were suspended. Some of the women spent the afternoon writing letters. Some slept. Elise, the youngest in Barracks D, barely 19, and from a village in Bavaria, she had left at 17 to join the auxiliary, sat on her bunk and cried quietly, which was such an ordinary thing to do on Christmas that nobody said anything or looked away. Ingrid, in a gesture so unexpected it temporarily shifted the atmosphere of the entire barracks, produced from somewhere inside her kit bag a small cloth doll she had kept since childhood. She set it on the shelf beside her bunk and looked at it for a long time without explanation. No one asked for one. Marta wrote 3 pages to her sister and sealed the envelope with the particular care of someone who knows the letter is a bridge, however thin, across a distance that has no other crossing. That afternoon, one of the British kitchen staff, a young private named Walsh, who could not have been older than 20 and who had the earnest manner of someone who had not yet learned to be cynical about anything, came to the barracks door and handed in a small paper bag. Inside were 6 mince pies, slightly crumbled from transit, wrapped in wax paper with a note that said simply, "Merry Christmas from the kitchen staff." He didn't wait for a response. He was already halfway down the path before any of them thought to say anything. The 6 women in Barracks D divided the mince pies with the mathematical fairness of people who have learned to regard food as something you account for, and ate them in the strange silence of people who have been surprised by something small and are not yet sure what to do with the feeling. Elise, still red-eyed, took a bite of hers and said very quietly, "It tastes like spice bread from home." No one answered because there was no answer to give. It was just a mince pie, and it was not home, and it was the closest thing to both of those facts simultaneously, and sometimes that is enough to hold a person together for one more night. The new year came and went without ceremony. January was the coldest month, the kind of cold that came through the barracks walls slowly and settled in the bones, and was not dramatic enough to complain about properly, but was present every morning when you woke, a reminder that the world outside was indifferent to arrangements made inside it. The farm work slowed in winter, reduced to maintenance tasks and feed preparation, and the long, uncomplicated work of keeping living things from freezing. Marta found she did not mind the slower pace. It gave her time to read more carefully, to practice her English in conversations with Sergeant Hammond, who answered her grammatical questions with the patient precision of a man who has no particular reason to refuse a reasonable thing, and to think. She thought about Germany in the winter, mostly. Not with longing exactly, longing requires a destination, and her sense of what she was longing toward had grown blurry in the months since the letters from Munich. She thought about the specific texture of a Hamburg winter, the way the Ulster froze in hard years and the city's character changed, became quieter and more private, the way all cold cities do when the familiar geography takes on a new white surface that covers the wounds. She thought about the flat above the dry goods shop, the narrow balcony, the geraniums her mother had maintained each winter in pots on the kitchen windowsill, wintered over with the stubborn attention of someone who simply refuses to accept that living things are only for summer. Her mother was in the countryside with cousins. Her father had not been found. She did not think about her father directly. She thought around him, the way you move around a piece of furniture in a dark room, aware of the shape of it, careful of the edges. By February, when the ground softened enough to be worked, Marta was ready for it. She cleared the garden plot again, pulling the winter's accumulation of dead matter and frost-heaved stones. The soil was darker than it had been in spring, deeper colored, denser with what the autumn had returned to it. She worked with a spade and then her hands, kneeling in the cold morning on the narrow strip of ground between the fence and the drainage ditch, pressing the soil between her palms to feel its state. It was ready, or close enough to ready to begin. That distinction, close enough to ready, was one Tom Calvert had taught her without namming it. The perfect moment to plant is a myth, he had told her in his dense Yorkshire shorthand, demonstrated more through action than language. You watch the soil, you read the season, and at some point the conditions are good enough and you make a decision and you begin. Waiting for perfect will cost you the planting window every time. She had been thinking about this more broadly than gardening in the long winter evenings in the barracks, about the difference between waiting for conditions to be right and deciding that conditions were right enough, about how much of her life since the end of the war had been spent in a kind of suspended state, not passive, not unwilling, but waiting for some signal that the moment to invest in the future had arrived. The garden had given her a different model. The garden did not wait for signals. The garden asked only whether the conditions were workable and moved from there. She pressed her palms flat against the soil, feeling its temperature, its give, the specific weight of its moisture. Close enough, she said to no one in particular. And she began. The spring of 1947 was the best season in the garden. By then Marta had been at Featherstone for over a year. She knew the soil now, or at least the specific strip of it behind the south fence, the way you know a difficult person after long acquaintance, its preferences, its resistance, its hidden generosities. She had ordered seed packets through the camp's mail system, using earnings from the farm work program, which paid a small daily wage into an account prisoners could draw from within limits. She had radishes and carrots, and 2 varieties of lettuce that came up reliably, and a climbing bean that used the fence itself as a trellis, and produced more than any of them expected. Tom Calvert visited the garden once, in early May, walking the fence perimeter on some errand connected with the drainage channel. He stopped and looked at the plot for a long moment without speaking. Then he nodded once, with the particular quality of acknowledgement that men like Tom reserved for things done correctly. "Not bad," he said. Coming from Tom, this was the horticultural equivalent of a standing ovation. Mrs. Pierce, who appeared at the camp gate one afternoon with a delivery of surplus seed potatoes, more than the kitchen needed, allocated on paper to the farm program, handed the crate to Sergeant Hammond and then asked him, without special emphasis, whether any of the women had found use for a few extra plant starts she had sorted from the greenhouse. There were tomatoes, peppers, a tray of early lettuce. She set them on the ledge, by the gate, with the decisive absence of ceremony of someone donating something they no longer need, which is not the same as not knowing exactly what they are doing. Marta accepted the plant starts without making more of the gesture than the moment required. But that evening, setting the tomatoes into the ground in the long early light, she thought about Mrs. Pierce's boots making the unnecessary drive to the camp gate, the crate on the ledge, the absence of ceremony. She thought about how some acts of kindness are designed to look like nothing so that the person receiving them doesn't have to feel the full weight of what they are. Ingrid, who had been watching from the barracks window, came out that evening for the first time and crouched beside the bean trellis without asking permission. She worked in silence for 20 minutes, staking a section that had begun to lean. Then she stood up, brushed the soil from her knees, and went back inside without a word. The next evening, she came back. By June, she had her own section of the plot, a tight border of radishes around a central square of carrots, tended with a systematic attention that should not have surprised anyone who had ever watched Ingrid do anything. Before we get to what happened next, I need to ask you something. If you had been in that room on that morning and they told you it was time to leave, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. The letters began in June. It started, as most quiet rebellions do, with one person doing a thing that seemed reasonable and slightly impossible, and everyone else realizing, in rapid succession, that it had not occurred to them to try it first. Her name was Hilda Brenner. She was 31, had been a medical records clerk for an army field hospital, and had the focused calm of someone who had spent years working alongside urgency without being consumed by it. In the second week of June, Hilda wrote a letter to the camp commandant, Major Holt, formally requesting consideration for an extended stay under the civilian labor provisions of the current agricultural assistance scheme. The letter was 4 paragraphs long. It cited a section of the relevant regulations she had located in a copy of the British government's prisoner management guidelines, which she had obtained through Sergeant Hammond's library list after 3 months of patient waiting. Major Holt read the letter, made a note, and sent a reply acknowledging its receipt and noting that formal representations would be reviewed in accordance with current policy. This was not a yes, but it was not a no, and in the precise climate of 1947, that difference had weight. Within a week, 6 other women had written their own letters, then 12. Within a fortnight, every woman in Barracks D had submitted a formal request for consideration, and word had spread to the other barracks. The letters varied in length and formality but shared a common shape. They were clear-eyed, not pleading. They did not pretend to misunderstand the situation. They acknowledged that they were prisoners, that the war had been lost, that the country they came from had done things that required accounting for. They did not ask for sympathy. They asked, in different words, for time. One letter from a woman in the 3rd Barracks, a 27-year-old former signals operator named Renate Kocher, whose file Sergeant Hammond later described to Major Holt as otherwise entirely unremarkable, broke from the formal register for a single sentence before returning to it. The sentence said, "Please, do not send us back to nothing. Major Holt underlined it, then set the letter with the others. Because that is what it came down to, and anyone who has lived inside genuine uncertainty will recognize it immediately. The Germany they were being sent back to was not a country. It was a partition. It was 4 different kinds of authority occupying the same geography without agreeing on what to call it or who it belonged to. The cities in the letters home were shadows of cities. The addresses were often approximations. The streets their parents had walked were sometimes renamed, sometimes gone. The women in Camp Featherstone were not dramatic people, as a rule. They did not speak in absolutes, but each one of them had received, in the past year, enough letters from home to understand that the word return had become complicated. Return to what? Return to where? Return to a bombed flat in a city divided between strangers. Return to parents whose addresses kept changing because the buildings they lived in kept changing. Return to a country that was not yet certain what it was, watched by 4 powers who each had different ideas about what it should become. Britain, with all its fences and regulations and cold morning water and mince pies at Christmas, was comprehensible. It was bounded. It had rules that were consistently applied, which is not a small thing when you have spent years in a place where rules changed with the front line. It had soil that produced when you worked it. It had a blackbird that returned to the south fence every morning. It had Tom Calvert, who nodded once when he meant well done. These were not romantic reasons to stay. They were practical ones. The romanticism had been burned out of most of the women in Barracks D by the experience of the last several years, and what remained was a fine-grained, practical attention to what was real and what was sustainable, and what would kill you quietly if you didn't account for it. The Germany described in the letters from home was not sustainable in that sense. It was a place built from rubble and administered by strangers and navigated daily without any of the systems that made daily navigation possible. To go back to, it was not a return. It was a beginning, and it was the kind of beginning that required resources, money, contacts, housing, some thread of the pre-war life still intact enough to pull on that most of them did not have. Hilda Brenner, who had been the first to write, was also the most methodical about it. She had made a list, which she shared with no one but which Marta saw once by accident left open on the common room table. It was a 2-column document in Hilda's neat medical records handwriting. On the left, reasons to go. On the right, reasons to stay. The columns were not equal. The right side was longer, but the entries were different in quality. The left side had larger, more definitive-sounding things: family, country, language, home. The right side had smaller things: stable work, predictable food, a known place, the harvest not yet finished. And at the bottom, in slightly different handwriting as though added later, I do not know what I am returning to. I know what I am leaving. Marta's letter was 2 paragraphs. She had spent 3 evenings writing it and another evening deciding whether to send it. The final version said only this: that she had been assigned to agricultural work for 14 months, that she had acquired skills in cultivation and crop management that were of practical use, that the work detail arrangement had been, by all parties' assessment, productive, and that she respectfully requested the opportunity to formalize her labor contribution under civilian contract terms to allow the farm work to continue through the harvest season at minimum. She did not mention the garden. She felt, instinctively, that the garden was the wrong thing to put in an official letter. It was too personal, too small, too honest. Official letters required impersonal justifications, arguments in the language of utility and productivity. The garden was neither of those things. The garden was a 20-foot patch of Yorkshire soil that she had spent 14 months learning to speak to, and that had, in some manner she could not fully account for, begun to speak back. You do not put that in a formal request to the British Army. What she did not know, and would not know until much later, was that Mrs. Dorothy Pierce had written her own letter that same week. It went not to Major Holt, but to the Regional Agricultural Board, and then, because Dorothy Pierce was a woman who believed in going to the correct level of the correct system, to a Member of Parliament representing the Yorkshire farming constituency. The letter described the specific contribution of the German work detail to the Pierce Farm's harvest figures over 18 months. It included numbers, because Dorothy understood that numbers speak a language institutions respect more reliably than feelings. It noted that the current labor shortage remained acute, that the women in question had demonstrated competence and reliability, and that the administrative logic of repatriating experienced agricultural workers, while the shortage persisted, deserved reconsideration. Tom Calvert, who could not spell well enough to write a letter, told the visiting agricultural inspector on his quarterly rounds that he had trained one of the German women to read a field as well as any hand he'd had in 20 years. He said it simply as a matter of record and let the inspector decide what to do with it. The inspector made a note. Dorothy Pierce signed her letter in the firm, unhurried hand of a woman who had decided that this was necessary and was therefore not particularly interested in the obstacles. If that moment hit you, and I think it did, then you already know this channel is different. Subscribe, not for the algorithm, because these women deserve to be remembered and someone has to keep telling their stories. The review took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of uncertainty that settled over Featherstone the way the English summer settled over the fields, not dramatically, but pervasively, present in every waking hour, resistant to being shaken off. The women continued their work assignments. The farm work continued. The garden grew with the indifference to human anxiety that gardens have always shown. Marta harvested the first of the climbing beans in early July and found, in the act of pulling the pods from the trellis with both hands in the warm morning light, a quality of attention she could not otherwise locate. Her hands knew what to do. The plant gave up the beans cleanly. The air smelled of wet earth and cut grass, and the particular fullness of a season that has delivered on what it promised. Ingrid had stopped talking about the August notice. She worked in the garden every evening now, and when she spoke, it was about practical things, the leaning of a stake, the dryness of the soil, whether the late carrots would be ready before the first frost. She had written no letter. This was her version of the same petition, conducted entirely in the grammar of physical presence. She showed up. She worked the plot. She staked the climbing beans and turned the compost and kept the ditch edge clear of the encroaching grass. If staying required proof, she was offering a different kind of proof than words. In the second week of the review period, something happened that Marta would remember for years. She was working late in the garden, past the usual hour, in the long July light that lingered in Yorkshire until nearly 10 in the evening. The camp had gone quiet. The guards were in their rotation. The only sounds were the drainage ditch moving slowly in the ditch and the wind in the fence wire, and somewhere beyond the fields, a sheep's distant complaint about something. Mrs. Pierce came to the gate. Not for any official reason. There was no delivery, no scheduled visit. She simply appeared at the east gate, spoke briefly to the guard on duty, and was admitted to the section of the perimeter path that ran along the outside of the garden fence. She stood there for a moment, looking at the plot through the wire. Marta had stood up at her approach, uncertain whether she had violated some protocol. Dorothy looked at the garden for a long time. Then she said, in her usual economy, "The beans are good this year." "Yes," Marta said. Another pause. "So's the tomato." "It came up by itself again," Marta said. "I didn't plant it." Dorothy Pierce looked at the volunteer tomato for a moment, its assertive sprawl along the fence post. She was quiet for a long time. "Chem," she said. Then she walked back to the gate. Marta stood in the garden for a long time after she left. She was not entirely sure why the sound of that one syllable, no commentary, no explanation, stayed with her the way it did. Only that it felt, for reasons she could not have articulated to anyone, like the closest thing to recognition she had received in a very long time. Elise, who had spent the spring making friends with a British kitchen girl named June who came twice a week with the Red Cross supply delivery, spent the review period in a state of suspended emotion that expressed itself, characteristically, through hyperactivity. She reorganized the barracks shelves. She learned to knit from one of the older women. She taught herself 3 verses of a Yorkshire folk song from a library book, which she could not sing correctly, but sang loudly, which was its own kind of courage. Sergeant Hammond did not speculate about the outcome of the review. He was a man who understood the difference between information and rumor and declined to deal in the latter. But Marta noticed, in the third week of July, that he had arranged for the garden's south fence section to be cleared of a dead post that had been leaning against it for months, replaced with a new one, straight and properly set. He said nothing about it when she thanked him. He said it had been on the maintenance list. The official response arrived on the 1st of August. Major Holt read it in his office and then called the barracks NCO and then walked himself to the common room in a departure from his usual administrative distance that was, by itself, a kind of communication. He was not a man who appeared in the common room for minor matters. He stood at the front of the room and waited for the women to gather. 9 of the 23 could stay. This was the number the civilian labor provisions allowed within the current agricultural scheme extension, subject to formal work contract, camp residency requirements, and biannual review. The selection criteria were based on employer assessment and camp work record. Those selected would be notified individually. The remaining 14 would proceed with scheduled repatriation. The room was quiet for a long time after he finished. Major Holt stood with the expression of a man who has delivered a piece of news that is better than no news and considerably worse than what was asked for, and who understands that both of those things are true simultaneously. Then someone at the back said, in German, very quietly, a single word that required no translation: 9. Marta was one of the 9. She knew before the individual letter arrived, because Hammond told her, a departure from protocol so small it was barely visible, and therefore enormous. He said only that her name was on the extension list, and that she should review the contract terms when they were delivered, and that the employment contact was the Pierce farm. She stood in the corridor outside his office for a moment after he closed the door, holding the information as though it was something fragile. Then she walked to the garden. The climbing beans were nearly done. The tomatoes had come in thick and good, far better than the first year, better than she had honestly expected. The carrots were ready. She would pull the last of them next week. There was a second volunteer tomato plant this year, appearing again near the fence post with its same assertive energy, and she had decided this year that she was not going to question it. She stood at the edge of the plot in the August afternoon and let the fact of it settle into her. Ingrid was not on the list. She had known this before she knew her own result, the same way you sometimes know the hardest thing first and save the rest for later. Ingrid had seen her name absent and had gone to the barracks and was sitting on her bunk with her back against the wall and the cloth doll from home on the shelf beside her. When Marta came in, Ingrid looked up with an expression that had been worked very hard to appear composed and had almost succeeded. Marta sat on the opposite bunk. Neither of them spoke for a while. August, Ingrid said at last, still. Marta nodded. I always knew it would be August, Ingrid said. The bitterness was gone from her voice. What was left was something quieter, which was harder to sit beside. The others leaving received their notices in the same week. Hilda Brenner, who had been the first to write, who had found the regulation, who had made the 2-column list, folded her notice in half and put it in her coat pocket without reading it twice. She had already done the accounting. She knew what the numbers were. The remaining days changed texture. There was a quality to the camp now that Marta recognized as the feeling of a place being packed up while still being lived in, the same quality she had felt in the Hamburg flat in the last days before her parents sent her east. Things took on a temporary weight. Ordinary evenings became specific. The blackbird at the south fence, which Marta had stopped noticing months ago the way you stop noticing anything that has simply become part of where you are, began to seem worth watching again. Elise and June, the kitchen girl, said goodbye on a Thursday afternoon beside the camp gate. June cried. Elise did not, which suggested she had decided in advance that she would not, which was its own kind of grief. She gave June her knitting needles because her mother had knitting needles in Bavaria, she said. And she would not need 2 sets. June held them and said something in Yorkshire English so fast and dense that Elise could not catch all of it, but the shape of it was clear enough. The night before Ingrid's departure, the 6 women of Barracks D, 3 staying, 3 leaving, sat on their bunks and did something that none of them had formally proposed. They talked until late. Not about the war, not about politics or the future or the incomprehensible geography of a divided Germany. They talked about small things, food their mothers made, shops in cities they had grown up in. The specific sound of a particular tram line, the exact shade of light at a particular time of year, the name of a dog that had lived on a particular street. The conversation was like a box of things brought out before a move, examined one more time, returned to memory. Ingrid, at some point close to midnight, said, "I will plant something when I get back. Wherever I am, I will plant something." Marta looked at her. "Even if it's a window box," Ingrid said, "even if there's no window." She almost smiled when she said it, almost. In the morning, Marta walked with her to the gate. The truck was already there, engine running, exhaust hanging in the cool August air. Ingrid turned at the gate and said something in a low voice that the engine noise obscured. Marta stepped closer. "What?" Ingrid said it again, more clearly. "Thank you for planting the garden." Then the gate opened and Ingrid walked through it and did not look back, which was the right thing to do, because looking back is for the people staying, not the people leaving. The autumn came in the way English autumns come, without announcement, arriving in the color of the hedgerows and the angle of the light and the particular weight of the morning air before full dawn. The farm work continued into October, longer than any previous season, because the harvest required it, and because Mrs. Pierce had calculated, with her characteristic precision, exactly how much labor was available and how far it could usefully be stretched. Marta learned to store root vegetables. She learned the difference between a storage clamp and a dry shed, and when each was appropriate. Tom Calvert showed her how to read the weather coming in from the west, using a set of observations about cloud formation and wind direction that he had learned from his father and that were not in any book Marta had ever read, but that proved, over the weeks, to be accurate enough to be trusted. He showed her how to thin a stand of winter wheat and why, and how to check a stored apple for the particular softness that means it has to be used now or wasted, and how to tell, by the smell of earth after rain, what kind of rain it had been. There was always more to learn. This turned out to be one of the durable properties of working land. The 9 who remained at Featherstone under the extended contracts were a different configuration than the original barracks had been. Some of the women Marta knew well. Others she knew only as faces at the morning roll call and fellow travelers on the farm truck. They arranged themselves, over the autumn, into a new kind of ordinary, not the ordinary of the early months, which had been so freighted with uncertainty as to be barely ordinary at all, but something more settled. Dinner conversations that did not revolve entirely around the absent. Games in the common room on Saturday evenings. A slow collective accumulation of routines, preferences, small jokes about specific things that had no context outside the camp walls, which is the particular intimacy that develops between people who share a bounded space for a long time and learn each other in the way of closed systems, thoroughly, with no corners left private. The staying was not easy. That is worth saying clearly, because the stories that history finds most convenient tend to smooth over the difficulty of the ordinary. Marta was still a prisoner. The contract was real, the reviews were real, the regulations were real, and the wire fence was real. There were mornings when the distance between Yorkshire and Munich was not a geographic fact, but a physical sensation, a weight in the chest that no amount of garden work could fully dislodge. There were letters from her mother that arrived with addresses that had changed again, written in a handwriting that had grown more uncertain with each passing season. There were nights when the camp was so quiet she could hear the river beyond the fields, and the river sounded like everything that was still out of reach. She wrote to Ingrid twice. The first letter reached her, care of a cousin's address in the British occupation zone, and a reply came back 3 weeks later. Ingrid was in Hamburg, or what remained of it. The cousin's house was intact. She had found work in a hospital administrative office. She was looking for a flat. The city was unrecognizable in some places and entirely itself in others, and she had not yet worked out which was worse. At the end of the letter, in the same practical sentences she used for everything, I planted a window box, chives and parsley. They came up. Marta read that paragraph 3 times. But there were also other things. The garden in its second autumn, stripped back to preparation for winter, but still holding the shape of what had grown. The bean trellis, which she dismantled and stored against the fence for next spring with a care that was itself a form of faith, the exact faith that involves preparing a space for something you cannot yet see but have decided to believe in. Tom's nod, now given more freely, a currency she had learned to value at its true rate. Mrs. Pierce, who paid the contracted wage without comment and supplemented it, twice, with produce from the farm store that appeared in a paper bag at the gate, labeled in Dorothy's firm handwriting, surplus. And there was the knowledge, not comfortable, not uncomplicated, but real, that she was still here, that the three-line notice had not been the last word, that the thing she had placed face down on the shelf in July had been answered differently than she had feared, that she had asked, in her two-paragraph letter with its careful, practical language, for permission to remain in a place she had not expected to want to remain in, and the answer had been yes. The first snow came in November. It fell on the garden and on the dormant bean trellis and on the fence post Tom had replaced in July, straight and properly set, and on the fields beyond, which lay white and enormous and still under a sky the color of old pewter. Martha stood at the barracks window in the early morning and watched it come down. She thought about Ingrid's voice at the gate, "Thank you for planting the garden." She thought about the seeds she had tucked into the inner pocket of her coat the day Ingrid left, a small twist of paper holding the last of the bean seeds from this season's harvest, collected because she always collected them, because that is what you do when you grow a thing and want the growing to continue. She had meant to send them with Ingrid. She had forgotten, or perhaps not forgotten exactly, had delayed in the way of someone who is not yet ready to release a thing to the distance it must travel, and then the gate had closed, and the truck had gone, and the decision had been made without her. The seeds were still in her coat pocket. She had found them again last week when searching for a button. She did not know what to do with them yet, but she kept them. This felt important in a way she could not entirely explain, even to herself. A seed is a thing that contains, inside its small sealed architecture, everything that a plant will be, its height and color, and the exact shape of its leaves, and the season in which it will produce, and the other seeds that will come from that production. None of that is visible from the outside. None of it has happened yet. It is all still waiting, patient and exact, for the conditions that will permit it to begin. You carry it with you, you keep it dry, you wait for the right ground. I'll leave you with one question, not about the war, about the moment. What do you think she felt, not in that camp, not in that year, but years later, when she was old and quiet, and the war was long over, and she remembered that morning at the gate? Write it below, one sentence. I want to read what you think. The women who begged Britain to keep them were not a footnote. They were not an anomaly. They were 23 women in a camp in Yorkshire who had arrived expecting punishment and had discovered something else instead, not freedom, not absolution, not forgiveness for anything that required forgiving. Something more specific and harder to name, the experience of being treated as though the future still applied to them. For most of them, the request was denied. For 9 of them, it was granted. For all of them. The act of asking, the drafting of letters, the formal petitions, the names signed in ink on paper sent to desks in offices that would take weeks to respond, was itself something. It was the act of a person who believes, against evidence and against history, that the future is still worth appealing to, that somewhere in the machinery of a country that had been your enemy, there was a process through which a plain and reasonable request might receive a plain and reasonable answer. That asking was itself the act, not the answer, the asking, the decision to believe, against every lesson the last 10 years had taught, that someone on the other side of a desk, in a country that had been your enemy, might read a plain and reasonable request and treat it as one. Martha Schreiber stayed in England for 2 more years under the Labour contract. She was repatriated in 1949 to Munich, where her mother was living in the second floor of a house that had belonged to distant cousins and had survived the war largely intact. She brought with her what she had accumulated, a small amount of money, a coat worn thin at the elbows, a clay-stained pair of work boots, a sheaf of letters from her sister, and in the inner pocket of the coat, a twist of paper holding a season's worth of climbing bean seeds, dried and stored since autumn. She planted them the following spring in a container on the balcony of the Munich flat, which was barely wide enough for 2 chairs. They came up reliably, as climbing beans do, and attached themselves to a length of string she had fixed to the window frame, and produced, in the warm weeks of summer, more than she had expected. Her mother watched the plants one morning for a long time without speaking. Marta watched her watching them. Neither of them said anything. They had learned, across the years and the letters and the addresses that kept changing, that there were things between them that language could not efficiently carry. This was fine. The beans were doing well. She kept the empty seed paper in the back of a desk drawer for the rest of her life. Not as a trophy, not as a souvenir. As a reminder of the specific, unhistoric, ordinary truth that sometimes the thing you plant in a borrowed piece of ground, inside a fence you did not choose, for reasons you cannot fully articulate, grows into something that follows you home. She wrote to Ingrid every few months after the repatriation. The letters were practical weather, work, what was growing on the balcony, how the city was slowly reassembling itself around the gaps the bombs had left. Ingrid wrote back in the same register. The hospital, the flat she had finally secured, the window box that now had 3 varieties of herb and a volunteer nasturtium she had not planted and was not going to remove. The letters never directly addressed the war or the camp or the 2 years in Yorkshire. They didn't need to. The whole of it was in the shape of the correspondence, 2 women who had learned something about endurance in a foreign field, continuing to apply it in the fields they had been returned to. Marta worked in an insurance office in Munich for 30 years. She retired in 1979. She grew things on every balcony she ever had, in every flat across 3 different addresses in the city, and she gave seedlings to her neighbors with the unhurried generosity of someone who has learned that the best things you grow are the ones you give away. She never spoke publicly about the camp. It was not a story she told. But her daughter, born 1953, named after no one in particular, remembered that when she asked her mother once where she had learned to be so patient with difficult things, her mother had thought for a long time before answering. "Yorkshire," she said. Her daughter did not entirely understand what that meant, but she remembered it. That is what the women of Camp Featherstone understood, the ones who stayed and the ones who left and the ones who begged, in 2 careful paragraphs, for the chance to continue tending something that had already begun to grow. They were not heroes of any conventional kind. They had not resisted. They had not escaped. They had not done any of the things that history tends to commemorate with plaques and dates and chapters in books. What they had done was something quieter and more durable. They had arrived in a place expecting the worst, found something different, and against every instinct shaped by years of war, allowed themselves to be changed by it. They had put seeds in borrowed ground. They had learned the weather from a man who would never speak about what divided them. They had written polite letters to a government that had every reason to refuse them, and some of them had been answered with yes. That is not a small thing. In 1947, in the wreckage of a world that had just finished destroying itself, the idea that a process could be trusted, that a letter might be read, that a request might be considered on its stated merits, this was not a given. It was, for people who had come from a place where all of that had catastrophically failed, a thing worth noticing, worth stating clearly in 2 careful paragraphs and sending through the official channels and waiting for. They did not beg for freedom. They did not beg for justice or forgiveness or any of the things history tends to measure. They begged for time. And some of them got it. And some of them carried the seeds of it home in their pockets anyway. And a generation later, a daughter in Munich asked her mother where she learned to be patient, and the answer was a place she had never been, spoken in a tone that made her feel she was missing something important. She was and she wasn't, because the lesson had already passed on the way lessons always pass, not in the telling, but in the living, in the window box on every balcony, in the seedlings given to neighbors, in the particular quality of attention a woman brings to difficult soil when she has already learned, in the hardest possible school, that patience is not passive. Patience is the decision made every morning to show up again and put your hands in the ground. The repatriation notice had been 3 lines long. What answered it took a garden, 2 winters, and the rest of a life, but it answered. And that was enough.